Do you think that the construction of the pyramid is a great mystery? Well, think again. Today we'll dive deep into the mysteries of the burial cloth of Jesus Christ, the infamous Shroud of Turin. Is it genuine or is it just a forgery? I'll be looking into various scientific papers and historical documents which you can find linked into the description. To start us off, we have the 1988 carbon dating study, which shows us that with 95% confidence the artifact dates back to the 13th or 14th century. Well, aren't we off to a rough start? This is the #1 go-to study for all the critics of the Shroud. But this is no reason to stop, there are plenty more studies. In fact, the Shroud is the #1 most studied artifact in history. So continuing from here, I'll assume that this is in fact a forgery and we'll look at different studies to see what we can know about the forger. The first thing to notice is that the image is a photo negative, done in the medieval times, a couple hundred years before photography. Well, maybe it's just a coincidence. For whatever reason, this artist decided to revert the colors so that the main image can be seen in reverse. Odd, but it even gets stranger from here. When we look at the dark and light areas of the shroud, they can actually be correlated with the distance between the body and the shroud, giving us a sort of 3D effect. Again, very unusual, maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe the artist drew some amazing picture and it turns out that it just perfectly coincides with 3D information. In fact, there was no paint found, no dye, no powder, nothing, which raises the question of how exactly it was formed. And it just gets even stranger because the dark and light areas are actually all the same color. The darker portions of the image were not due to a variation of the degree of the yellowing of the fibrils, but rather due to the presence of more yellowed fibrils per unit area. Which basically means that there was like a yellow fibril, and then a white one, and a yellow one, and a white one, and the more dense they were, then the darker the image appeared. So okay, the forger clearly didn't paint this image. Whatever caused this seemed to be some kind of different process than an artistic process. So what could it be? It could be maybe burning, for example, you would think. But actually no, and the reason for that is the most surprising fact of all, is the fact that the image is only 200 nanometers thick. The coloration is basically just on the outer layer of the cell wall of the fibrils. This is about 0.25% of the width of a human hair. It's ridiculously small. This is almost impossible to do with heat because if you try that, you wouldn't just burn the surface layer, you would burn much further and deeper into the fibrils. Well, technically you can do that and we have done it. One person has actually accomplished to reproduce this effect, maybe not others, but at least they managed to reproduce this one, using an ultraviolet pulse laser. Yeah, that's right. An ultraviolet pulse laser with some nanosecond duration so that the laser doesn't burn further into the cloth. If it was done for too long, it would burn through. If it was too weak, it wouldn't appear at all. So what exactly is the forger doing running around with a high-tech laser in the Middle Ages? I think that this makes the forgery explanation really unlikely. I mean, come on, a 200 nanometer photo-negative 3D image on a non-photographic piece of material without using any kind of paint, dye or powder? There is no way this could be done in the Middle Ages. And you think this is bad enough for the forger hypothesis? Well, let's keep going. Real blood has been found on the image, or so you would think. It's actually not on the image, but underneath the image, meaning that first the forger would have to place the blood in anatomically correct locations and then make the image on top of that. Yeah, nobody would go to the trouble of doing that. First, normally anybody would want to make the image and then put the blood on top, if anything. A potential hypothesis is that the forger found a real cloth with real blood of a real crucifixion victim, with all the wounds of a Roman whip wrapping around his body, and then painted the image on top of that. Well, not painted, laser printed or whatever. So it looks like it's a real body and the image and the blood came from the body, and there is some more evidence for this. The analysis of the direction of the blood on the shroud suggests that the victim was in fact crucified and the blood flew down, and then he was laid on one side and then perhaps on another, and that's where we get all these different blood directions from. So that's it. Okay, it's not a forgery. It's definitely not a forgery. We can safely say that there was a real body, it's a real shroud. Maybe it's not from 2000 years ago, we don't know, but it's not a forgery. So let's investigate the hypothesis that this image was made by some natural process. Okay, so first of all, it has to be mentioned that this is the only burial shroud with such an image on it. No other burial shroud has been found with a 3D 200 nanometer photonegative image on it. It couldn't come from a body to cloth contact because, as we know, the shroud was laying on top, and there are some areas like between the nose or around the neck where there should be no image whatsoever, and yet there is, and the darkness of the image corresponds to the distance from the cloth. So whatever caused the image had to have happened over a distance. But it couldn't be any kinds of gases either, because the image is about 200 nanometers thick. Any kind of gases or substances that came from the body and went onto the cloth at a distance would have penetrated much deeper into the cloth. Not only that, but any such natural process would have smashed the image. It would be nowhere near as detailed as it is. Like, this is almost a printer. It's way too detailed for any natural process. But here is the main fact that makes it impossible for this to be naturally generated. There are no images on the side and the top and the bottom. There is only an image of the front and of the back. There are no side images. If it was a body in there that generated these images naturally through some kind of natural process, we would expect the image to be smudged everywhere, across the front, sides, back, all over the place. So it cannot be naturally generated. Well, that's a problem, isn't it? It's not a forger and it's not a natural process. So then what is it? I think there are only two possible explanations. It's either the genuine cloth of Jesus Christ and the event of the resurrection, which is supernatural, would create this image which looks to be as if it's supernatural, or it's aliens. Yes, you heard me correctly. Aliens. If the pyramids can have their crazy alien conspiracy theories and the shroud is much more difficult to explain than the pyramids, then we can have them as well, because why not? So, first of all, is there any evidence at all that this artifact is the genuine burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Let's take a look. First of all, according to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, Jesus was flogged before the crucifixion. And just to confirm, I found a paper by Gary Habermas that actually found that scourging was a more or less normal precursor to crucifixion. Now, if we look at the image on the shroud, we can see consistent flogging marks on both the front and the back. And this actually makes a lot of anatomical sense, because the Roman whip would most likely not only hit the back, but wrap around the body and hit the front also. Moving on to our next observation, we have the crown of thorns found in Matthew, Mark and John. Now, while flogging is quite common in Roman crucifixions, the crown of thorns is not. This is quite unique to Jesus, and they did this because Jesus named himself God and King, and they put the crown of thorns on him to mock him for that. Now, if we look at the image on the shroud, we can see blood dripping from the head on both the front and the back image, consistent with the crown of thorns. The next obvious observation is the wrist and feet wounds from nails. This is because crucifixion victims were nailed to the cross. We can find a more direct reference to the nail wounds in John, and a more indirect one from a prophecy in Psalms 22. And by the way, Psalm 22 is what Jesus was reciting when he was dying on the cross, when he said, my Lord, why have you forsaken me?" No, Jesus was not in despair, he was quoting the Old Testament. There was some skepticism whether nails were used in Roman crucifixions, but again Gary Habermas comes to the rescue and confirms that in fact they were. Now, if we look on the shroud, we can clearly find the nail wounds in the wrists and the feet. And here's the interesting thing. No medieval artists actually correctly painted where the nails should go. Rather than painting the nail wounds on the wrists, they are typically painted on the hands. The problem is, if that people were nailed through the palms, then they wouldn't last on the cross. The tissue would rip and they would fall down. So most people did this wrong, and this particular piece did it correctly. And to top that off, some concerns about the hands have been raised. For example, why the thumbs are missing. And again, this is something that you would expect from a crucifixion victim, because if the nails were driven through the nerve in the wrists, the thumb would bend in an unnatural way, hiding behind the palm, which is exactly what we see in the image in the shroud. So again, if this was some medieval expert, he would not only be expert in some kind of crazy imaging technology, he would also have to be a medical expert in crucifixion. Next is the side wound, which can be found in the Gospel of John, as well as some prophecies like the prophecy of Zechariah. Again, looking at the image on the shroud, the side wound can be clearly seen. But here's the interesting thing. The blood from the crown of thorns, from the nail wounds, from all the flogging was studied, and it was found to be pre-mortem, meaning before death, which is what we would expect from a crucifixion victim. But the wound on the side is post-mortem, meaning that it was afflicted after his death. And we can see this because the blood splits cleanly into like bloody particles and a serum, which is a description that we can also find where blood and water poured out from the wound. Now let me just backtrack a little bit. Remember when I told you that the blood came first and the image came second? Well, this is actually also consistent with the resurrection. If Jesus died, then he would be wrapped in a cloth, and only 3 days later would the miracle occur where the image would be on the cloth. So you'd have the blood first and the image second. Everything seems to align. There is a documented miracle that could explain the image on the shroud. All the wounds correspond to a crucified man. The crown of thorns is quite uniquely belonging to Jesus. That's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that the shroud in fact did belong to Jesus. But what about the alien hypothesis, you may ask? Well, once we find any evidence of aliens, let me know and we'll consider it. So if we have all this evidence and everything seems to point that this is in fact the genuine burial cloth of Jesus Christ, what's up with the carbon dating study? One of the leading hypotheses suggests that the carbon dating is actually genuine, but it comes from a repair on the cloth. During sometime in the 15th century, there was a fire, actually there were probably like 3 fires that the shroud endured, and some molten silver fell onto the shroud, creating holes. These were then patched up a couple of times throughout the centuries. One study found that while most of the shroud is made from linen, the part where the sample was taken from actually contains quite a bit of cotton. This suggests that the carbon dating study could be unreliable. A new study from 2022 used a modern technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering to date the shroud to around 2000 years ago, plus minus a couple hundred years. Yeah, so it's not the most precise, but it is non-destructive, which is a massive bonus since carbon dating destroys any sample that it dates, and we only have one Shroud of Turin. We don't really want to go around destroying pieces left and right. Having said that, I do think that we should probably take a couple more samples from around the cloth and date it again just to be sure. But now here comes the tricky part. If you think that I've mentioned a lot of studies and a lot of papers and a lot of research, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Actually, there is many more studies done on this, and there are studies going back and forth, for and against. This huge amount of papers is a bit of a problem because it allows anybody to basically pick whatever papers they want to justify their claim. And this happens even today. Like, I found some reviews that look comprehensively at many of, or almost all the different arguments that I just mentioned, and they conclude that the shroud is fake. And then there is another one which concludes that the shroud is genuine. So really what this highlights is the problem with us. We've been led to believe that science will always lead us to one definite conclusion, but that is not the case. There are multiple possible conclusions that you could come to. And on top of that, the papers keep coming out, so even if you conclude and you find the latest study on the topic, you're probably going to find a counter-example to that next year, and then a counter-example to that the year after. It's just never going to end. And why will it never end? Why is this so studied? Why does everybody care about the Shroud of Turin in particular? The skeptics would like to say that Christians are just biased and really want to prove that Jesus existed. Unfortunately, I have some bad news for the skeptics. Most Christians don't come to faith in Christ because of the Shroud of Turin. This is just an icing on top of the cake for us. In fact, many Christians are very skeptical of the Shroud. We have various other kinds of historical evidence, we have the four Gospels, we have the fact that Christianity is the biggest religion in the world and all the advances and benefits that it brings. We have just so many more things than this. Many people don't even know about the existence of the Shroud of Turin. So why do Christians study this so much? Well, if this is the genuine burial cloth of Jesus Christ, then that's a very important artifact for us. But that's all it's ever going to be, it's just an artifact. We don't place our faith in it, we don't need it, even if it was proven to be false the next year. It wouldn't do anything for us, really. But this is not the same for the skeptics. If this is the genuine burial shroud of Jesus Christ and it documents a miracle, what that means is that atheism and every other religion is false. Yes, you heard me correctly, there is an even bigger incentive to prove that the shroud is wrong for all the skeptics than there is for the Christians to prove that it is correct. Now, here's the core of the issue. No matter what we do, whether it's science or anything else, everything that we ever do is motivated by something. It has to be. No matter what field of science you want to study, it's something you want to study because you care about it. If you didn't care about it, you wouldn't even try to study it. You have to pick what to study. So the people that study the shroud study this because they have some reason to study this, some bias or some motivation behind it. There is no way about this. We live in this illusion that science is this objective thing where there is absolutely no subjectivity involved. That is false. Subjectivity is always involved in all of science. And not just in all of science, but in everything else we do. If you decide to do anything, then that decision is motivated. It's as simple as that. Now, here's the thing. When do we stop doing something? We stop doing something when we either want to give up or when we have accomplished our goal. The skeptics always go to the carbon dating study and they don't care about anything else. Once they found that it came from the 13th century, they stopped their search. But look at the image, look at how complex it is. Maybe this suggests an even earlier date for photography. Maybe this suggests some other supernatural event. Maybe it's just a very interesting piece of artifact or a natural process that is very uncommon. Either way, this is a very interesting artifact, and the fact that they don't want to study it further only suggests that all they care about is the skepticism. They just want to prove it's wrong. I mean, just think about it. Any scientist that would dedicate a huge amount of time to performing a study and writing a paper on the topic would have to be motivated by something. And if they are generally interested in the shroud, they would want to try to explain the image. They would want to try to explain all the properties of the image. They would want to try to explain the blood and all the anatomy and the biology inside of it. But they don't want to do that. They just want to find one piece of evidence that proves it's wrong, because that's all they care about. The Shroud of Turin is like a thorn in their side. It attacks their worldview, because if it's true, then their worldview is false and Christianity is true. So it's a big problem for them, and this is why they get so defensive. And this is exactly why I would be very skeptical of all the skepticisms coming from them. So as you can see, there are strong motivations and potential biases to study this on both sides. And this is why this is one of the most studied artifacts in history. This brings me on to my next point. Christians, I know that many of you are skeptical about the shroud. But be careful about this, because, as I've just explained, there are many skeptics that are hell-bent on proving this artifact to be false. So if you're waiting for the perfect opportunity where there will be no critique of this, you're never gonna find it. There's always going to be somebody who's going to stick their nose into this and try to prove it wrong. Instead, I suggest to look at many of the different studies and try to at least explain how the image could be formed and why all the wounds correspond so closely to the wounds described in the Bible. Because that is not something a forger could do. So while I understand why you're skeptical because of the carbon dating study, please also apply some of that skepticism to the forgery hypothesis, because clearly this image couldn't be a normal forgery. What I'm trying to get at is that you shouldn't just pick one skeptical study and based on that single study dispel everything. Just look at all the different positions and try to explain the alternative. Okay, if it's a medieval forgery, then how did they do it? Or if it is not a medieval forgery, why is the carbon dating wrong? Like, there are two conflicting hypotheses, it's not just one. So it's a much better idea to look at the overall picture rather than picking a single study to be skeptical about. So with all that in mind, with all the evidence available, from what I can tell, it would be much easier to fake the carbon dating study than it would be to fake the image, which we still can't do, by the way. And with that in mind, I can safely say that the image on the shroud and the shroud itself is most likely the first ever selfie in the history of the planet, and is the selfie of our God and Lord Jesus Christ. What do you think about the shroud? Is it real? Is it fake? Do you have some more studies to share? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe.